Welcome to meeting number 34 of the Standing Committee on International Trade. We have with us as new members today Sima Khan and Ali El-Hassi. Welcome to the International Trade Committee. It is one of the more interesting committees on the Hill, and we have some great members on all sides with us. Today we're only meeting for an hour as the clerk was unable to schedule the witnesses for the second hour. So pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, February 12th, 2026, the committee is resuming its study of free trade within Canada. We have with us today from the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters, Ryan Greer, Senior Vice President, Public Affairs and National Policy, and from the Confederation des Syndicats Nationaux, Caroline Seneville, President by video conference, and from the C.D. Howe Institute, Ryan Manuka, Research Fellow, and also from the Confederation, John Delche, Union Advisor by video conference. Welcome to you all. Mr. Greer, I invite you to make opening remarks of up to 5 minutes, please.
Great. Well, thank you, Chair and members of the committee. On behalf of Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters, I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this study. CME has been advocating since 1871 for policies that help manufacturers grow, compete, and contribute to our communities, and free trade within Canada is certainly one of those issues. 18 months ago, interprovincial trade surged to the forefront of the domestic policy agenda. While it was sparked by U.S. tariff actions, perhaps rather than because of a principled vision for a unified Canadian economy, it was nonetheless welcomed by manufacturers who have long advocated for the removal of these barriers. Of the many dimensions on the issue, I'm just going to focus my brief remarks on the most important factor, in our view, for unlocking interprovincial trade, which is mutual recognition. Harmonization, where every province adopts or tries to align their standards, certainly looks tidy on paper, but it is slow, costly, and almost impossible at scale. We've seen this demonstrated by the Regulatory Reconciliation and Cooperation Table, a body established in, I think it was 2017, specifically to harmonize regulations that has done some good work, but completed only a handful over that time. Mutual recognition is much simpler. If an economic activity, whether producing, selling, or providing a service, is legal in one province or territory, it ought to be accepted as legal everywhere in Canada. The principle allows differences to exist, but stops them from becoming barriers. It respects provincial jurisdiction, and it's the only approach that can be scaled across the entire economy and made durable against political erosion. And we've seen some encouraging progress. The Canadian Mutual Recognition Agreement on the sale of goods, federal enabling legislation, some provincial legislation to align rules, all steps in the right direction. And I think it would be fair to say that Canada has certainly done more in the past 18 months to dismantle internal trade barriers than we've seen in substantive action over the previous few decades. This is genuinely remarkable and deserves acknowledgement. But we are now at a precarious moment in the reform cycle when governments may believe that they have done enough, where there is the potential for some tariff-driven urgency to fade, depending on how our negotiations with our neighbors to the south go, and when the structural incompleteness of what has been built gets buried under press releases. I'll share just a few brief observations on the current state of mutual recognition. One, we have some concerns that we are drifting towards a permanent patchwork rather than a clean, universal mutual recognition architecture. This is seen, for example, in how provincial approaches are varying and how they recognize an inbound workers' qualifications. The CMRA also covers goods sales, but not the rules for how those goods are produced. So a Canadian manufacturer expanding production capacity into a second province gets mutual recognition for the product under the CMRA, but its plant still faces entirely separate permitting processes, a different occupational and health and safety regime, differing energy and emissions requirements, and differing building standards. So the agreement as it exists, or as it is starting to exist, recognizes what crosses the border, but it says nothing about what it costs to build and operate on either side of it. Similarly, the commitment to negotiate an expansion of the CMRA to include services by the end of 2026 is a welcome development. However, whether it will result in a genuine mutual recognition instrument or more of a CFTA-style framework agreement with carve-outs and limited enforcement is still an open question. And of course, as this committee has discussed, labor mobility provisions are still leaving gaps for trades and professions that are requiring province-specific exams or provincial practical assessments. CME is worried that these gaps will keep large parts of our economy fenced off from the benefits of internal trade reform. We have 4 recommendations on what the government could do to build on the momentum behind mutual recognition. The first is to build and publish some sort of national mutual recognition scorecard and dashboard to help Canadians and businesses track transparently what each jurisdiction has implemented, what's outstanding, and where carve-outs persist. We could potentially integrate some live business feedback with that. We think that the mutual recognition process specifically should be a standing agenda item at First Ministers' meetings to help keep leaders focused and accountable, and that could certainly include reviewing the scorecard results in public. We think it's time to explore a process to better align new regulations at birth and prevent divergence before they start. There is no substantive mechanism in place to require provincial regulators to consult across provincial lines as part of the standard regulatory development process. This is when the design of the regulation is at its most malleable, and we think that ought to be done. And lastly, we would encourage the federal government to use its fiscal levers, both carrots and sticks, to help drive provincial alignment during this period. For example, the Labour Market Development Agreement funding could be conditioned on provinces demonstrating adherence to defined credential and recognition timelines. In conclusion, the risk of where we're at today is not necessarily failure. I think the risk is that Canada succeeds just enough to stop. A patchwork of mutual recognition is not mutual recognition. Every day we settle for something less is a day Canadian manufacturers compete at a disadvantage, Canadians pay more, and Canada builds less than it should. The momentum exists, and we hope this committee study continues to help ensure that our governments use it. Thanks, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gier. Ms. Senneville and Mr. Delche, please. You have the floor for up to 5 minutes.
Oui, bonjour. Merci.
Good day. Thank you for welcoming us. We are a trade union, a confederation with 1,300 members in Canada. Our point of view will be different from that of manufacturers. We understand that our discussions around internal trade are touching on regulations, and the current context means that it is necessary to discuss that. So we are not against that principle. However, we are not persuaded that even if we did get rid of all regulations and barriers, that it would bring our economy to the next level. In fact, when we ask entrepreneurs, why do you not do business with other Canadian provinces? The main reason that they name is distance. So, yes, of course, in the current context, we need to review our economy, but reviewing our geography is more difficult. Our economy was based on external trade as well as internal trade, and not only with the United States, with Europe, etc. And Mark Carney mentioned that he wanted to continue to build external trade, and we believe that our economy is mostly based on this, especially because our internal trade, is very weak. In our opinion, one of the difficulties we're faced with, whether it's with internal trade or international trade, the biggest difficulty with our economy is a productivity problem. So, of the OECD countries, we are very low in Canada. And not only that, but we have seen our productivity go from low to even lower. So we think that productivity must be increased. And unions are participating in a project in this regard with great enthusiasm. So in order to do this, we need to invest in equipment, in staff, in workers, especially in this era of technological change. Our workers need to be able to overcome these challenges, and we will be there to help them. So let's come back to barriers between provinces. First of all, there are fewer barriers between provinces than there are, for example, in all of our international agreements. So I believe that there is a myth around that. As I said earlier, we can always look at regulations. And yes, regulation must be adapted based on the need that there is for regulation. So our opinion is not that there's a problem of too many regulations or too few. The question is rather, are the regulations doing the job they are supposed to do? And if not, then yes, we can change them. We are particularly concerned by the subject of mutual recognition, where this could be a spiral downwards. When it comes to food safety, worker safety, we are a union federation, so we work very closely with other bodies in Quebec to make sure that worker health and safety standards are respected. There were 257 deaths in Quebec in the past year because of workplace danger. So we do not think that Canadians can afford to put at risk those regulations. And also, when we open up for internal trade and get rid of barriers and regulations for that, it also opens Canada up to all countries with whom we have treaties or agreements, and they're very numerous. So this is a downward spiral within Canada and also a downward spiral regarding our international trade. So yes, it's necessary to question ourselves, but we have to ask ourselves the right questions. So I can say in closing that something very important to us is a recognition of the French language. When we talk about labor mobility and business mobility, it is absolutely necessary, and this is a big battle that we have fought since our founding in 1921 at the Confederation of National Trade Unions, is to protect the French language. So the recognition of language rights and worker health and safety is very important to us for the members that we represent in Quebec.
Another 5 minutes with Mr. Manucha, please.
Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup. On a sunny October day in 2012, retiree Gerard Comeau traveled the 2 hours from his house in New Brunswick to Quebec. Prices were cheaper, and he's a rational economic actor, and he was on his quarterly beer run. Mr. Comeau had no idea that this seemingly innocuous trip would land him in front of the Supreme Court and would catalyze a national conversation about the state of domestic trade. On re-entering New Brunswick with his haul, the RCMP detained and fined him, confiscated all his booze, for the distinctly Canadian offense of having too much alcohol in his trunk coming back from another province. Internal trade barriers are a feature of our constitutional setup. They're not a bug. They are the natural byproduct of a system that assigns substantial authority to our provinces. Mr. Comeau's run-in with the law symbolizes our nation's long-standing struggle to achieve economic unity within a federal structure. But internal trade barriers are more than just liquor limits, and we do not have to accept them as fate. Well, let's use another example, standards. At the dawn of Confederation, the distance between the two rails of a railway track in the Maritimes was different than that in Upper and Lower Canada. It was 4 feet 8 inches in one and 5 foot 6 inches in another, which meant that at intercolonial frontiers, operators had to move goods and people from one rail car to another simply because of a difference in standards. That is an internal trade barrier, and it added money, time, and extreme inefficiency. Internal trade barriers stem to deeply embedded domestic regulatory patchworks, like the railway track width differential, which ultimately harm Canadian productivity and economic competitiveness. 2025 saw massive strides on internal trade reform and incredible intergovernmental collaboration, but the job is far from done. It is relatively easy to table legislation and sign MOUs. The challenge is in implementation, and the hard work really is just beginning. The remaining divergences are wide-ranging. Just to name a few, we're talking National Safety Code implementation for trucking carriers, securities regulations, electrical codes, occupational health and safety rules, building codes and fall safety training programs. Again, just tip of the iceberg. I co-authored a piece with Professor Trevor Toome out of the University of Calgary, where we found a patchwork in rules and regulations facing trucking added 8.3% to the cost of freight rates. That's a $1.6 billion drag to the Canadian economy. Divergences on everything from driver qualifications for long combination vehicles to mutual recognition of farm license plates and the definition of sunrise and sunset amongst provinces. Now for some credible, politically saleable and implementable federal actions here. First, Parliament should update the Statutory Instruments Act to require federal regulators to rely on consensus-based standards wherever possible. I've written about this with Senator Colin Deacon. Standards advance faster than any one government's regulators can to keep up, and the EU has embraced this with great success. And think about the divergence in the EU. Second, the House should pass Senate Bill S-239, which is being introduced by Senator Marty Klein, which strengthens and makes more clear the Competition Bureau's ability to study and report on internal trade. Doing so would institutionalize internal trade reform, helping it endure beyond the present moment. Australia did something very similar to great success. Third, it sounds like the two Ryans here of like mind. The federal government should condition labor market development agreement funding on provinces and territories, publicly demonstrating compliance with the 30-day standard for credential recognition. Canada's governments all have agreed to a 30-day standard, and so to recognize inbound workers. And so the disclosure is the only way to audit compliance, and money is going to help. I'll end with this. I watched the committee testimony from Minister LeBlanc when he was here, and there was a lot of talk about the relationship with the U.S. Two-way goods and services trade with the U.S. is $1.2 trillion. Internal trade is $500 billion. CUSMA is receiving a ton of time, attention, and resources in internal trade, and I thank the committee's work for it. Should be continuing to be treated with seriousness as well. Thank you so much.
Much on to our members. Mr. McKenzie, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A very straightforward question to each of the two witnesses present here. Mr. Greer, do we have free trade within Canada today?
No, I would say there's been quite a bit of progress, as I said in my remarks, and we're encouraged by that, but there is lots of work remaining too. I don't want to say finish the job, because I think this will be an ongoing project as long as any of us here are around these circles, but there's been substantive progress. There's not free trade within Canada at this moment.
Mr. Minucha, same question to you. Do we have free trade in Canada today?
Complete unfettered free trade is aspirational. It will never be achieved. What we're seeking to unlock is competitiveness and productivity, and we're trying to diminish trade barriers where we can. We will never get to zero, and I don't think we would love a Canada where there are zero trade barriers.
So I want to ask a couple of questions, Mr. Minucha, in relation to your answer, but first being, is there more the federal government can do? Its constitutional powers. Declaring that we would be, Canada would have free trade was ambitious, ill-advised might be another description of that. That was the declaration of our Prime Minister last year, given the fact that a great deal of the existing trade barriers are indeed provincial areas of authority. But there is Section 9210 of the Constitution. But my question is, what do you think the federal government can actually do to push free trade internally in Canada?
There are internal trade barriers from commission and omission, right? So yes, technically there are a lot of regulations on the books still when it comes to environmental protection or transport, or if we get to the territory of supply management, that are technically internal trade barriers. But there's also the omission. A central government has a responsibility to stand up and be the central coordinating force amongst the provinces and territories. And this is where the federal government needs to be strong. The championship needs to be strong from the center. So, yes.
Now, it strikes me that barriers in trade are fundamentally protectionist in nature. So over a great number of decades, the existing framework that is in place today has been built up. Our provinces have put rules in place, generally speaking, to protect their own domestic industry within a province. So is it, in fact, true that there are winners and losers as we try to harmonize or at least get mutual recognition for trade within Canada?
Canada's future, our productivity, is what the loser is if we don't try to do something about internal trade. It connects. No one cares about the definition of high visibility safety apparel or how many Band-Aids are in a first aid kit. What we care about is GDP growth, the well-being of Canadians, and our ability to prosper for another 100 years, and that's why internal trade is important.
Mr. Greer, do you see that the same way? Your membership would say there's a plethora of rules and regulations in place now in Canada, put in place by the provinces, that don't contribute to improvement in product safety and improvement in workplace conditions don't make major positive contributions to our country, but do get in the way of a frictionless trade between provinces.
I think it's important to think about this question in the way that Canada thinks about international trade. So manufacturing is an entirely trade-exposed sector, as we've experienced in some very detrimental ways in the last 18 months. But there were plenty of people who said, as Canada looked to expand its trading relationship with the United States or abroad, that there was going to be winners and losers. Canada, Canadians, and the prosperity of all of us and our communities have benefited from this. And the same is true of taking a similar approach to internal trade within Canada. And so for manufacturers, they've adapted to a system that has all these small distinctions and differences. But there's cost to doing that, and they would welcome a simpler, easier way to move their products, build facilities, and move people anywhere in the country.
So there may be costs in adapting to a better harmonized internal trading relationship, but those costs would be outweighed by the benefits.
Hugely, yes.
And particularly where our Canadian industry is already capable of competing internationally, the fact that it's productively or effectively prohibited from competing internally is really just completely illogical. Is that correct?
Well, it not only hinders us, and it would be fair to describe Canada as a relatively high-cost jurisdiction to do business. Internal trade barriers are one of those reasons. So making it easier and more affordable to do business within Canada will also make us more competitive in new markets.
So the federal government's leading role, and Mr. Menchuga, if I could come back to you to say, where is that leadership role that we haven't seen from the federal government? Where could that go? Could you talk about what you think is its first priority?
I think we should make it explicit as part of the Competition Bureau's mandate as internal trade should be formally under their purview. They are the institution that will mechanize internal trade reform for years to come. Internal trade is a very exciting topic now, and we get to speak before you on this topic. It will abate, but if we have the machinery in place with a standing body like the Bureau, who are tasked and who are expert at policing anti-competitive product, that would be fantastic for years to come. That would be what I would focus.
And those are steps that could be taken today.
Correct.
Effectively, they're within the reach of the federal government.
Correct.
All right, after we do that, what's next? Where do we go from there?
The big exciting announcement was about the spread of this concept of mutual recognition. When I drive over, my driver's license in Ontario is recognized in Quebec. It's activating that across the economy. And right now, the focus is on the construction and manufacturing when it comes to modular home codes, or when it comes to building product material recognition across the country, and having a focused attention and leadership from the center, where you have the Committee on Internal Trade driving that path forward. But really the most important thing is the federal government, in conjunction with its first ministers across the country, coming out of the Council of the Federation they're not at it, but that body of first ministers needs to be setting very specific KPIs for the internal trade community. We need to know what the agenda is, and it can only come from the top, because internal trade touches on fiefdoms and turfs that it gets very touchy. So you need the muscle from first ministers on this.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. President. Madame Lapointe, please, for 6 minutes.
Madame la Présidente. Bienvenue à tous les témoins.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Welcome to all of our witnesses, and thank you for being here. I have a question for you, Ms. Senville. Earlier, you were talking about how you have 330,000 members in Canada. How many of those are in Quebec?
Peut-être 300,000?
Perhaps 300,000. We have a pan-Canadian union. We have unions in Ontario and New Brunswick, but most are in Quebec. I asked that question because you were talking about all of Canada, and you mentioned mutual recognition. Of course, we have professional rules that are different when it comes to the recognition of different types of professions. Especially in construction, it can be very difficult to work across provinces. When it comes to labor mobility in Canada, how can we improve it while respecting regional uniqueness? And also, by the way, I agree with your comments regarding the French language. When it comes to construction, we have a labor shortage. Often, it's difficult to find employees, And I would even say within one single province, there's a shortage of local labor. And this can lead to problems. For example, when labor comes from outside the province where the project is being built, it creates housing and logistical problems. And it also has an impact on the local economy, because if major contracts are happening, those workers will come from outside of the province. So why would my local business grow, since competition is from elsewhere? So that is certainly problematic, and I think that it's necessary to find a balance. When it comes to labor, there's a Canadian label, and I forget the name of it, but it's for Canadian construction. And it's one of the most integrated sectors, but we have to be careful when we talk about labor. For example, we saw what happened when trucking regulations were eased. We saw what happened for health and safety. There were deaths on the road following that. So in our view, we don't want the lowest, the person who, or the business that respects regulations the least to receive the contract. And we've seen a lot of health and safety problems in construction. Also, if we don't speak the same language, then we can't understand each other's safety regulations. In Montreal, we saw a translation issue where a worker did not know how to proceed. And I would say, too, that there are some rules that are useless and others that save lives. Thank you very much. I could continue with you, but I'll ask a question to Mr. Ryan Greer. Earlier, you mentioned patchwork and how it's important to be important with recognition, that it's not done in patchwork. We've also heard about duplication of different regulations and certifications that vary from one province to another. In your opinion, what are the most realistic and immediate measures that the federal government could put in place in the coming years to simplify these processes without compromising on health and safety standards, as we have discussed?
So for the federal government, I think we really ought to take an all-of-the-above approach, which in trying to incentivize continued provincial momentum. The actual federal barriers themselves are minimal, and the government has, to its credit, taken movement to remove a lot of its exceptions and try to eliminate strictly federal barriers. The federal government has an important role as a convener, but also to help create the right incentives. As the other Ryan noted, there's a really important role for generating and sustaining momentum that must come from the federal government. There's too much political variability, different regional dimensions and prioritization, whether it's the minister in a province who's in charge or a particular regulator that may not be willing to play ball. There needs to be strong sort of political momentum from first ministers to continue to ensure that the momentum that we have achieved doesn't get lost, and we don't end up in a sort of hybrid patchwork where we've made some progress, we have to implement mutual recognition. We still have a wide variety of approaches to labor mobility. We still have a number of professions that are stuck outside of it because of provincial certifications and other things. So we need to be very sober of assessing progress, being proud of it, but really doubling down now and trying to continue that momentum. And the federal government plays an essential role. And there may be some statutory measures around the Competition Bureau. There's going to be other ways around, as I referenced, potentially some sort of public reporting or a scorecard, a little bit of celebrating those who are moving furthest and fastest, and perhaps naming those who aren't.
20 seconds remaining, please.
Rapidement.
Just quickly, do you see real willingness to collaborate when you look at the provinces? Where are the main roadblocks, in your opinion?
I think there is a genuine interest in collaboration. We've seen that from first ministers. I think the roadblocks are the systems. We are talking about dozens and dozens of regulators across every province who all have their own interests in preserving some of the work that they've done. So I think structurally are the biggest challenges, and so it's around ensuring that political momentum.
Thank you very much, Mr. Greer. On to Mr. Savard-Tremblay for 6 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to all of the witnesses for being with us today and for your opening remarks. Ms. Senville, I thought it was very interesting. You mentioned things that we've been hearing a lot. In a submission regarding Bill 112 in Quebec, you were talking about how internal demand would not be able to make up for the loss of trade with the United States. And we can't rely on businesses to make that transition. So even if barriers were removed, and I am in favor of that, whether it be within Canada or with other nations, but I don't think we can do it at any price, or at all costs, rather. There are studies that show that internal trade, even in the best of possible worlds, it will never make up for trade with the United States. So even if, in and of itself, this principle we're in favor of, can you tell us your thoughts? We saw that a bill was adopted here in Parliament, C5, that then would lead to ordering Council giving approval for major projects. So do you think that this could pose a threat to Quebec? Because language laws can be considered a barrier, and unionization can be considered a barrier, and other values that we have in Quebec. There's an extremely long list. So do you anticipate any potential attack on the way things are currently done in Quebec? Well, it is true that Quebec is the only province to have French as the only official language, and that is something that has been difficult to preserve. We are in favor of work being done on regulation. For the federal government to be able to play a coordinator role, we are also in favor of that. But it is true that it will not be simple. I went to Alcoa in Baie-Comeau a few months ago. Aluminum is one of our great strengths in Quebec as well as in Canada. And I heard there that products are sent from them to the United States, where they're processed and sent back to Canada as tinfoil and aluminum cans. And I asked, why is this not done in Canada? And they said, well, you need aluminum processing plants. It's very expensive. And even if there was one of these in Canada, with 40 million residents in Canada, we cannot make it so that that type of facility would be lucrative. So I hear you also on the rate of unionization. In Quebec, it's around 40%. In other Canadian provinces, it's around 20%. You can tell how important it is to us. And it's also under the Charter, that right. I'd like to mention alcohol as well. Oftentimes we hear how beneficial it would be, but just look at how well the American boycott is working for us now. Well, there's a reason for that. And this is why I say that we need to look at the reasons behind the regulations in place and be very careful. So yes, I agree with comments by other witnesses that it's a constant job that needs to be done to ensure that the right regulations are in place at the right time. But if we approach this issue by simply telling ourselves that there are too many rules and we need to get rid of them, then we would be making a grave mistake. You took the example of alcohol. So the SAQ is the Quebec Liquor Corporation. Should parts of it be privatized or all of it? Everyone has their opinion on this. But I think that we can all agree that Ottawa should not be the one to impose changes there. So what are the barriers that you have heard about around alcohol other than the existence itself of these corporations? Well, I heard an example earlier, the fact that we would be able to go from one province to the other with alcohol. I think that that's a superfluous rule. Also, when you were mentioning rail travel, when it comes to regulations that vary between different provinces, I do agree with that example. I think it's an easy an easy answer. The solution is easy. Those regulations, of course, we can get rid of those. But if we dig deeper, that's when it gets more complex. I think it's important for Quebec, but for other regions as well. Could you elaborate on that last point, please? Well, I would imagine that it would also be true for Alberta. That's a random idea that comes to mind for me. Alberta probably also believes in certain things that it wants to protect. Thank you very much.
Gurlo, for 5 minutes, please.
Bonjour, Madame la Présidente. Chers invités, bonjour.
Good day, Madam Chair. Welcome to our witnesses. I'll start with you, Mr. Greer. A simple question. Is there free trade in Canada?
No, there's not free trade in Canada, and as Mr. Minutia alluded to, that's an unlikely goal that Canada will ever achieve, but certainly we're hopeful we can move further along the scale of toward free trade through some of the steps that have been taken by governments over the last 18 months.
Merci, Monsieur Manucha.
Thank you, Mr. Minutia. Is there free trade in Canada?
La même réponse.
The same answer.
That is not the end state of Canada, and I don't think we would want that.
Je vais revenir à vous, Monsieur Greer. Est-ce que les
I'll come back to you, Mr. Greer. When it comes to interprovincial trade barriers, are they costing our businesses money and time?
Money and time is an important one. There is a major opportunity cost to, for example, if you have a facility in Alberta and Ontario, there's different working at height regulations. So you can't transfer one employee between the two to do the exact same job. You need to recertify them for working at height. That is a small distinction that not just creates complexity for the business. That's something that creates cost and time for trying to do what you want to do. So there's certainly actual cost, but there's huge opportunity cost to our entire economy to creating that kind of confusion, especially for small and medium-sized businesses and individual workers who've got to sort of consider what they are attempting or would like to do, how that measures across a dozen different jurisdictions.
Merci, Monsieur Greer. Je vais y aller d'accord avec vous. Soyons pro.
Thank you. Mr. Greer, I'll stick with you. Let's be proactive. We all agree that we need to increase and improve our interprovincial trade. Here around this table, we all agree. What are your top 3 recommendations? What should we put in place as a committee? What could we quickly put in place to support our businesses, manufacturers, or others? 3 of your top recommendations.
Start with number 1, and I mentioned in my remarks, is the role the federal government can play is around accountability and transparency. So much of this rests in terms of what the provinces will do, the speed at which they'll do them, the mechanisms at which they'll do them. So, for example, Alberta has made some progress in implementing the mutual recognition agreement, but they've built in a ministerial override for anything covered by the agreement. That creates a lot of political uncertainty. That creates a lot of opportunities for any government, a future Alberta government, to back away from commitments to the MRMA. So I believe the federal government could do some sort of national reporting scorecard. It could be independently managed. You could have experts like Mr. Minutia and others help to account for progress that is being made on internal trade, where the gaps are, where carve-outs persist, where approaches are divergent in a way that makes it harder for companies or individuals to do business across borders. I think that's of the many things, I think that's one thing that the federal government could do that could substantively help incentivize the right behavior, because it is a very complex issue. We're talking about, dozens and dozens of different regulations and rules across all these jurisdictions. We need to have a central place where Canadians and businesses can understand where progress is happening and where it's not.
Merci. Madame Senville, même
Thank you. Ms. Senville, the same question to you. What are your top 3 recommendations that we must put in place at this committee? Well, I would say that, yes, transparency. We wholeheartedly agree with that. And after that, well, the priorities: protect workers' rights and protect the French language. But what we are concerned about is that when faced with different rules and regulations, harm would be caused if we don't look closely enough at the rules. Perhaps some rules could be strengthened as well. Thank you very much. Mr. Minutia, same question. What are your top 3 recommendations for this committee to be proactive? Thank you very much.
My first one would be, what is the power within this room? I'm not asking, a provincial, legislation here. It's the federal government here. So what's in the federal government's power? One would be updating the Statutory Instruments Act to allow for consensus-based standards to act as satisfaction for compliance. The next one would be, the Competition Bureau having, passing the legislation that started with the Senate, but passing legislation that gives them that explicit institutional might over this. And then third would be using a little bit of the power of the purse to uphold the 30-day standard that every government, in the Confederation has agreed to, the 30-day standard to recognize inbound credentials.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fonseca, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses and witnesses here on the Hill or here in the Ottawa region. We've got the Canadian Building Trades Unions are here having their advocacy days. And one of the things, I met with them yesterday, and they talk about moving on these major projects, and they want to move at speed and scale. Speaking to a member of the IBEW, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, who are Red Seal members, they are able to go interprovincial. They were talking about working on the grid, building out the grid in BC, nuclear plants in Ontario, wind projects in the Atlantic. So have they got it right how they're doing it? So they're able to that labor mobility works with them. I know there are only so many Red Seal professions, but what can we learn from what Red Seal, what they've done in the building trades to be able to take that into other labor markets? Sure, Mr. Mnuchin.
I think the Red Seal example is fantastic. It's that mobility across bounds where the credentials are recognized. And I understand at this committee and through some of the witness testimony, there's been discussion and fear about health and safety and even cultural matters, and that's totally legitimate. The beautiful thing about mutual recognition is well-constructed mutual recognition creates escape valves, so you don't have the race to the bottom. If a province starts going in one direction, the beautiful thing about what we're doing and activating this concept is that you have that fail-safe. You say that goes below a standard. It's not an open season here when it comes to regulatory safety. But the Red Seal program is a beautiful example of this in practice.
So do we take that roadmap of the Red Seal and implement that, like I said, with other professions,
Take Australia, who did exactly what we've been doing for the past 16 months and trying to do. Again, we've talked about it, now it's the doing of it. 20 occupations went to national licensing standards because the regulators were in such constant communication with one another. They were forced to confront, are we really different? How are we different? How can we bridge that gap? Because this is an annoying difference. There are many ways to get that, but mutual recognition really is that pathway to creating those common platforms that the EU and Australia show work.
And Mr. Greer, you mentioned that in the last 18 months, more has been done on interprovincial trade than in the last number of decades. So with that, and to continue that momentum going, you speak about a scorecard. Can you kind of give us some insight into that scorecard?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned earlier, the hardest part for policymakers, for whether they be business owners or even workers or other interested parties to understand and assess interprovincial trade barriers, as they are so multifaceted and complex. There's been tremendous progress, but it's hard to know beneath the news release proclaiming mutual recognition. What does it include? What does it exclude? What steps remain? What commitments have been made? What pressure do we need to put on services so that the work in 2026 is productive and doesn't have a bunch of carve-outs? So it's very difficult to understand and navigate about where progress is and isn't. So we think something fairly simple and accessible could be pulled together that can really help demonstrate very clearly to those of us in this room, but other stakeholders across the country, who's doing what at what schedule, perhaps where there's been delay or carve-outs or people are taking an unnecessary complex approach to mutual recognition, because a patchwork version of mutual recognition that still has a number of that is still confusing for small businesses and workers. It solves some problems, but it also creates other ones, and that you're still trying to assess what can I do between province X and Y. So we think that's a fairly simple, transparent way that the federal government can help incentivize the right behavior, but also just make it clear to everybody where progress has been made and where it's still remaining.
And what I've heard so far from your testimony, from all of your testimonies, has been that much of the friction that's still happening, it's about 90% is mostly provincial. So getting rid of the federal barriers, most of the labor, the workforce would be under provincial jurisdiction. And with the provinces, I know they have many in the regulated professions. That is a challenge. So how would the provinces deal with those regulated professions, be the College of Physicians and Surgeons, the lawyers, et cetera? How do they address that? Because that seems like that's been a big barrier for a long time. And
A brief answer, sir.
If there are organizations anywhere in the country that seek to preserve gaps or differences, they ought to sort of explain why something else being done in another part of the country is unsafe or insufficient. I'm not, it's not clear to me that there's any province in any regulated profession that's operating in a way that is endangering Canadians and workers in any substantive way. And if that's happening, then we ought to have a conversation about what those standards are. But more broadly, we need to push for alignment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Greer. Mr. Savard-Tremblay for 2.5 minutes, please.
Madame Sainte-Ville, j'ai envie de demander aussi, est-ce que...
Mrs. Sainte-Ville, I also want to ask you, so first of all, the overall question, are there particular sectors that should absolutely be excluded from any mutual recognition efforts? Well, those that are already excluded, fishing, aquaculture, forestry, agriculture, among others. For example, Hydro-Québec, Hydro-Québec comes to mind for me, alcohol and cannabis. They should be excluded. So do you think that there is a risk of a race to the bottom? And we know about the importance of the social safety net. So is there a risk if a province were to respect less strict regulations than another province? You talked about health and safety. Are there other risks? Yes, environmental risks, risks around working standards. So yes, indeed. There's also the risk that if we do not have internal barriers, if we ease rules, they will also become eased for everyone with whom we do international trade. And that can pose a problem when it comes to the Canadian economy. And I repeat, yes, the barriers can be costly, but when we ask provinces, or rather businesses and provinces, why don't you sell elsewhere? They don't talk about rules. They talk about the cost of transport because of the distance, and regulations are much lower down on the list. So I believe that if we only focus on regulations and not the rest of our economy, we will miss the boat. Do I have any time remaining? Okay, and when it comes to consumer protection, I think Canada or Quebec is more advanced than the rest of Canada. Can you comment on that? Yes, absolutely. Because residents of Quebec are not just residents, they're also consumers.
Mr. Van Popta for 5 minutes.
Good. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. I'll start with Mr. Minutia. Nice to have somebody here who knows trade law and constitutional law. I'm going to ask you a question along that line. I think it's fair to say that Canadian courts have taken a generous rather than a legalistic approach in interpreting the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Probably started with the Big M drug mart case that we all had to read when we were in law school, where Chief Justice Dixon stated that charter rights must be interpreted generously and purposefully in light of the underlying objectives. And that led to what some critics would call the start of judicial activism. Add to that a more recent development of courts applying a charter values framework to find, for example, that a territorial government had to provide French language education even to children who were clearly not Section 23 rights holders. Never mind what the charter actually said, what really was intended, right? So it brought judicial activism to a new level. Yet, when it comes to interpreting sections of the old B&A Act, Constitution Act 1982, I'm thinking of Section 121, the so-called free trade section of the old B&A Act, the courts have taken a very narrow approach to reject initiatives by people, the Como case, for example, or or legislators, for example, the national securities regulations deal. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Be here all day. Hopefully everyone's buckling up for this. Well, no, what I love about this question is, yes, we got stuck. The Section 121 that the Honourable Member discusses is the free trade clause in the Constitution. And we kind of got stuck in a 1921 decision where they said internal trade barriers have to do with customs duties and tariffs, essentially. And that's what we got stuck in for a long time, still pretty much are stuck in that. We have not progressed in the same way. I think we have to like segment out the charter from like the BNA Act and the sort of the genesis and sort of the interpretive authorities, but it is true that like when the whole world came to realize that internal trade barriers are more than just about tariffs, they're about the behind the border non-tariff regulatory measures, it seemed as though our judicial system couldn't keep up. And maybe in another, like we've seen it increment every 20 years. The Comeau decision moved it a little bit, but we've come to realize that like the court is kind of saying, hey, this is the responsibility not for us, but for the legislative, the elected members of our society to be inching this forward. Like we have an understanding, and we could reopen it by doing some sort of constitutional work, but I don't think that's on the table. But this is where we are now. So we went to a political agreement with the Canadian Free Trade Agreement and its predecessor to try to inch it forward. So, long story short on your question, yes, we're held back by an old version back when clergy people were our economists in the 1920s, and sort of we're kind of like grappling with that a little bit.
Thank you. Now, I think you were suggesting that perhaps the Canadian Competition Bureau could be put in charge of regulating and advancing free trade in Canada. Like, isn't that going to run into the same narrow thinking that the Comeau decision or the National Securities Regulator decision ran into?
Competition Bureau is pretty well seasoned at sort of policing anti-competitive behaviors and trying to create markets, create space for Canadian small and medium-sized businesses to compete. Internal trade is about efficient allocation of resources, making sure that we can actually be a G7 economy of competitive intensity, right? It's the proper orientation of our internal people, capital, labor, and all the factors of production. And so the Bureau, being there with soft powers, advisory powers, investigatory powers, and being able to memorialize research and advise on the matters of internal trade, which is better than the status quo, which is we have a non-political, non-activist secretariat in Winnipeg that runs the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, it needs to be sort of nonpartisan, uninvolved, and unaffiliated, but you kind of need some more centralized authority in the federal government who has a coordinating responsibility.
You have 30 seconds remaining, sir.
Good. Okay, so one of you gave evidence about the volume of trade between Canada comparing to the volume of trade between the provinces, suggesting that perhaps if we just had free trade between the provinces, we could improve our economy substantially. But are we comparing apples to apples? Because trade barriers with the United States are tariff-based and with regulations and differing standards, but between the provinces is really just the latter. So are we comparing apples to apples?
A very brief answer, please.
Sure, I think that there's a great degree of opportunity, it's up to 7% growth to the GDP. It's a sovereign, it's subnational jurisdictions. You'd think it'd be easier. We have complete control, and we're all part of the same, nation here. So in that respect, you would think that you'd be able to achieve things that you can't in Mar-a-Lago.
Mr. Lavoie, please, for 5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci encore une fois.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you once again to our witnesses for taking the time to come here. I have 2 questions for Ms. Senville, first of all. Here's my first question, and I'll be very frank. I was very surprised by your remarks twice, and I have questions for you regarding that, and I'd like to give you the opportunity to elaborate. You started by saying that the internal trade market was very weak. I'd like to hear you on that, because according to economic studies, we're talking about boosting GDP in Canada by $200 billion. And we want to increase by 7% productivity. So I'd like to hear you on that. And secondly, you mentioned that internal barriers were a myth. And that's the first time I've heard anyone say that. So I'd like to hear you elaborate on that. And Mr. Minucha also gave us examples in his opening remarks of many barriers that exist within Canada. So if you have concrete examples, could you use them to explain to us why this is a myth? So for both of those, I would like more details, Ms. Sinville. It works better when my microphone is on. Okay, so it's been said we do not have tariff barriers in Canada because we're in the same country. So when I said there are fewer barriers in terms of internal trade as compared to international trade, that's what I meant. When it comes to unions as well, when we negotiated NAFTA, we found that the protections of wages, the protections of workers were not sufficient. Chapter 9 on workers was not robust enough. And when CUSMA was renegotiated, it was strengthened, but the mechanisms themselves were not strengthened. So I would say that trade must be free, but the entities who are workers who make it so that trade work also need to have this freedom to make sure they have good wages, proper safety. These things need to be protected, and there cannot be social dumping. Also, I'll give you the example of the aluminum industry. If you told me that in Canada we should have our own alumina processing facilities, I would be all in. I would agree. But at 40 million Canadians, even if I were to place it in Winnipeg, right in the middle of the country, geographically, it's still not barriers and regulations that make things difficult. It's not the reason. I understand, Ms. Sinville, but my question was, why, in your opinion, is internal trade very weak? Because we've looked at all of these economic studies that talked about this potential of $200 billion, because we only have 40,000 Canadians, and we're a very geographically large country. We have a lot more geography than history. Well, $200 billion is not enough. I'm not saying that it's not enough. I am saying that we can't just look at regulations. We have to look at the economy as a whole. Thank you. My next question is for Mr. Greer. You talked about momentum, and we have been meeting with other witnesses who say the same as you, that we should try and accelerate trade among provinces. But I would like some more details on something you mentioned. You talked about carrots and sticks. Could you go into further detail, please? Because I have an image in my mind, and I think about collaboration between provinces. We should have carrots and sticks. Could you please give further details on what you were saying?
Yeah, the one specific example that myself and Mr. Minucha alluded to is perhaps tying labor market development funding to sticking to the 30-day commitment on credential recognition. These are the types of things, especially, we don't know what's going to happen north-south and with the U.S., but the genesis of the progress in 18 months was not because premiers or first ministers or other, woke up and said, it's time to do the things we haven't been doing for a long time. It happened because of threats to the South. If those threats abate, if we reach a deal with the United States, if any other number of things happen economically, we're worried that will take some of the momentum out that we have achieved. And so the federal government ought to be looking at all the different ways that it can promote that. So I've mentioned transparency and accountability and reporting. But looking at all of the federal engagements with the provinces and deciding how to incentivize the right behavior. This happens all the time. It happened over climate policy. It happens across a range of different policies. Of that pecking order of engagement and leveraging carrot and sticks in a collaborative way, we think internal trade ought to be at the top.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to our witnesses, as always, very valuable testimony as we move forward. For the information of committee, on Thursday we will be starting our study on trade with Japan. Right, so we look forward to starting that at that particular time, but rest assured we will be continuing to work on free trade within Canada. So thank you very much. I move adjournment.